Deanna, why do you think melatonin, the so-called sleep hormone, is one of the most overlooked keys to reversing aging, supporting the immune system, and even influencing metabolism? And why are we unknowingly sabotaging our health if we have a melatonin deficiency?
Whoa, that's a loaded question, Ben. There are so many angles to go from there. What I would say is that melatonin is an ancient molecule. It's ubiquitous. It is in plants, it's in animals, and it's in our bodies, it's in our cells. And what I would say, especially with your audience of biohackers and people that have an interest in longevity, is that it is very connected to the mitochondria. This is why we need to know about melatonin. It's not so much about sleep. Sleep to me is just a byproduct of what melatonin does, but it's not really just a sleep hormone. In fact, I feel like it's had a bad reputation because it's been pigeonholed. So when we just think that a molecule does one thing and we keep hammering on that, even though it's not solely that, I think then there becomes all of this misinterpretation. So I think that what we all need to know and recognize, what I want everybody to walk away from this podcast with, is knowing that melatonin is natural. It's part of nature. It's part of our cells. It's part of our being. And it's the thing that synchronizes us with nature. So we can
So
slice and dice any part of that, but I do think that there are a lot of misconceptions about melatonin.
there are. I agree because that's the first thing people think of. I need it for sleep or it's used for sleep. And why, while it may help with that, and we'll discuss that, you said something really interesting how it influences mitochondrial health. The mitochondria, as we know, are really important. And I think one of the things that we could agree about, because there's a lot of people in the health space, influencers, doctors, scientists, who disagree on about a lot of things: carnivore diet, keto diet, paleo diet, vegan diet. But one thing we could all agree to is the importance of supporting healthy mitochondria to age gracefully, to feel good. So how does melatonin influence our mitochondria?
Yeah. Well, let's just back up into mechanisms for a second because that's going to help us to understand how it works within the mitochondria. So much of aging, longevity has to do with how we metabolize, how we actually create energy just from the cell. And when we create energy, many times a byproduct is a lot of waste, a lot of free radicals, a lot of damage. And this is why time restricted eating and looking at intermittent fasting has become all the rage to enable our mitochondria to clean house, to get rid of faulty mitochondria. So, where melatonin enters into this is because melatonin is a very unique antioxidant and in a very different way than we probably know antioxidants. And in fact, I used to say that antioxidants are so 1990s, but when we look at melatonin, it's like a 21st century antioxidant. And I'll tell you why. First and foremost, melatonin is both fat soluble and it's water soluble, which means that it can traverse through many different body compartments. And the mitochondria is a pretty complex structure. It has different types of membranes, it has different pathways and things to cross, it has an electron transport chain system. It's got a lot of different wheels of metabolic activity. So the fact that melatonin can traverse through membranes, get into the cytosol, it can go in the liquid and into the fat. And that's really important for the mitochondria because that antioxidant activity is then going to be even more powerful. And it's been estimated by Dr. Tan. If people don't know who Dr. Tan is, TAN, he was one of the first to talk about melatonin, the mitochondria, and antioxidant activity. And his research denotes that one molecule of melatonin can quench up to 10 free radicals. So,
Wow.
nitrogen and oxygen type of free radicals. So I think that from the aspect of just looking at its antioxidant function, that's really key because, again, the mitochondria is creating a lot of waste. And so melatonin is cleaning up everything after this metabolic activity. And again, I want to put it in perspective because many people think about antioxidants kind of generically. They think, oh, vitamin C, vitamin E. But if you look at the potency of vitamin C, we're looking at quenching something on the order of 1 to 2 free radicals. And vitamin E is very specific to just being fat soluble. The other thing that I want to mention by way of the mitochondria and talking about antioxidant function is that I know that people fall in love with glutathione. They love glutathione. It's like, oh, the mother antioxidant, and we need glutathione for detoxification. Yes, to all of that, absolutely. But what we also know is that it can help, melatonin can help to stimulate the production of more antioxidants like glutathione. So I often like to point that out, that perhaps the mother of the mother antioxidant, as we know it, is melatonin. And when I think of the mitochondria, I do think of the maternal line, I think of the maternal DNA. So perhaps there's something to that. The other enzymes that are connected to antioxidant function and the way that the body repairs itself at night is that melatonin can stimulate superoxide dismutase, glutathione peroxidase, and glutathione reductase. I don't know about you, but I just find that that's really intriguing because a lot of these enzyme systems go up at night at around like 2 a.m. We start to see a peak in a lot of these enzyme systems and including melatonin. And if you think of plants, why do plants produce melatonin? Typically what you see in plants is that the seeds or the reproductive function of the plant is where you find the highest concentrations of melatonin. And one of the ideas there is that melatonin is a growth factor. It actually creates more phytochemicals within plants. So, and perhaps you'll ask me too about food sources of melatonin. I'd like to drill into that. But all in all, this is why melatonin is so important. And unfortunately, endogenously, it goes down with age. So then we become more susceptible to the diseases of aging.
So fascinating. Were you referring to Dr. Barry Tan earlier when you said Dr.
Not
Tan?
Barry. His name is
No.
actually Dunshan Tan. It's DUN-XIAN and then Tan. I know Dr. Barry Tan is doing more fatty acid and
Yeah, vitamin E. He's more vitamin E. Yeah.
yeah, but no, Dr. Tan, who actually worked with Dr. Russell Ryder, and Dr. Russell Ryder is
Yeah.
like the grandfather of melatonin. Like Jeff Bland is to
Yes.
functional medicine, Russell Ryder is to melatonin, and Dr. Tan worked in the lab of Dr. Ryder.
Very cool. Yeah, I wanted to bring up Dr. Wright later on with some of his research. Going back to what you just shared, okay, this is very interesting. So, one molecule of melatonin will quench about 10 molecules of free radicals, is what you said.
Yes.
When we think about other antioxidants, vitamin C and others, it's maybe two of these free radicals are quenched. So, this is really more powerful than any other antioxidant out there. Would you say that since melatonin is fat soluble and water soluble, and the effect that it has on the mitochondria, that melatonin would probably be the most important antioxidants for the mitochondria?
I never want to position something as kind of like a miracle molecule because nature works with redundancy and nature works in teams of compounds and molecules. That said, I do think that melatonin is like one of the leaders. It's one of the ones in charge of some of the others. So it's not like you can just hammer on all things melatonin and be fine. I think that the body needs complexity, it needs diversity, it needs redundancy. But to answer your question, I think that melatonin is a heavy hitter in the mitochondria. We know that it's twice as effective as vitamin E. It's 5 times more potent than glutathione at neutralizing like the hydroxyl radical. And even when melatonin breaks down in the body, its metabolites act as antioxidants. That's one of the things that you'll see that Dr. Tan has written about. And in fact, Dr. Tan, I actually met with him and we had this whole conversation and I had him repeat this twice because I was like, am I really hearing what you just said? He said that by taking melatonin, you can actually help your mitochondria to increase melatonin. Now that
Mm.
I went into the literature to just verify that. And I think from a cellular and an animal, kind of like preclinical work, we might see that. But in terms of actually looking at that in humans, I still think we need to get there. But all in all, the if we look at the data, we look at the lineage of research on melatonin, it's pretty compelling for the mitochondria. So I think that For everybody who is concerned about aging, like when we hit in our 30s, when we are mid 30s, our melatonin endogenously is going down. So let me just clarify, because we have pineal melatonin, which is melatonin made from the pineal gland through the signal of darkness, and that has a very specific function. That signals the circadian signal and synchronizes the peripheral clocks throughout the body. So pineal melatonin is very specific, and that's what I'm referring to, that we know that pineal melatonin released at night, that starts to decline from middle age on, right? So by the time you're like me in your 50s, you are pretty much at like 10% of what you had when you were a teenager. And then you move your way into your 60s and you're really bottoming out. And even I was looking at Dr. David Perlmutter's Instagram this morning, and I saw that he had a nice post on melatonin and looking at its role in Alzheimer's disease. So we're starting to see that perhaps this endogenous production of melatonin may actually be implicated in neurodegenerative diseases, or even, anything that is connected to the mitochondria, diseases of dysfunctional energy production or metabolism. We do need to think about melatonin.
It makes sense to me, right? When we think, like you just said, when we think about the mitochondria, the cells that are most metabolically active contain the highest concentration, the brain being the highest concentration,
Mhm.
and the ovaries, the eyes, the heart. So it would make sense that melatonin would have an effect, a positive effect on those cells that have the most mitochondria. Deanna, you published a research paper, and I didn't tell you this offline. I wanted to tell you this during the conversation, but I'm publishing a book with Hay House, comes out May of next year,
Great.
all about the metabolism. And there's a section in the book about supplements and biohacks for anti-aging and fat loss, free biohacks and biohacks that you pay for. But there's a section in that chapter on melatonin, because I love melatonin,
Great. Oh, I'm so
and
glad.
I referenced your study in the book,
Oh,
by the
thank
way. So I
you.
gave you a nice little shout out. So the study is titled "Is Melatonin the Next Vitamin D?" A review of emerging science, clinical uses, safety, and dietary supplements, which we'll reference in the YouTube notes and the podcast notes. But I'd love for you to share more about this study. What did you discover doing this study?
Yeah, this is a review article. Many, heads and brains have come together for this paper. And, being in nutrition science for some time, let's just look at vitamin D for a second. It's a very interesting vitamin. We call it a vitamin, but actually, behind the scenes, we start to see that vitamin D is more like a hormone, because there are receptors that have to receive vitamin D. So, vitamin D is one of those things like melatonin, where I think its definition is much more robust and expansive than how we've defined it. So, in the paper, what we were looking at is side by side a comparison looking at vitamin D and melatonin. And I have to say, Ben, that my interest and how I even came into this with the group of authors that collectively wrote the paper is that if we looked at kind of like where people were really engaged with their immune system, looking at COVID-19, viral replication, vitamin D and melatonin were at, I would say, like the head of the class on all things nutrient related, right? And then when you start to look at a comparison of vitamin D and melatonin, they seem to be very complementary. So with vitamin D to me would signal a sunlight deficiency. It's a biological light sensor, whereas melatonin could signal a darkness deficiency. And in fact, we actually coined that phrase in the paper. One of the authors on the paper, Dr. Catherine Darley, came up with that as part of our conversations, that most people, due to the surplus of electric light, all this artificial blue light, it's very detrimental for our eyes, and it suppresses melatonin production. And I want to go into that a little bit more at some point, because even the color of your iris can determine that degree of suppression. So there are some
Interesting.
personalized aspects, but melatonin is the biological dark sensor. Vitamin D is a biological light sensor. So think of them as yin and yang. Think of them as brother, sister. I call them circadian nutrients. That's kind of my term for them, because they share certain properties. They both have a hormonal action. So even though I said melatonin is, not just a sleep hormone, it does play a role as a hormone related to the pineal gland, but that's not its only function. So that's why I like to just quickly respond to that whenever I hear it. They also play roles as antioxidants. They're potent anti-inflammatories. They do modulate the immune system. Vitamin D also helps to regulate the mitochondria. And just even system-wide, they have these kind of joint effects and activities together. And in fact, there was a clinical trial in which the researchers were looking at a population of women. So it was a relatively small study, under 100 women. They took blood samples to look at vitamin D and melatonin. They gave these women a sleep questionnaire. And what they found was that, like we would anticipate, a majority of the women were either vitamin D deficient or insufficient. So upwards of 80% of them had some issue with vitamin D. And okay, so we would anticipate that. But what was new in the study was that they found that higher melatonin levels were associated with reduced risk for vitamin D deficiency. In other words, vitamin D levels seem to be correlated with melatonin levels. And there was even a connection with sleep in this study. So the takeaway here is, and I kind of see it like a triangle, right? Because melatonin, vitamin D, like the foundation of the triangle. Up at the top, I think we also need to be thinking about magnesium, because magnesium we know is implicated in not just sleep and muscle relaxation, but it's also one of the cofactors that is required by the hydroxylase enzymes to convert precursor vitamin D to active vitamin D. So when people do high doses of vitamin D, it can actually precipitate an even worse magnesium insufficiency or deficiency, right? So we need to be thinking about this triad: melatonin, vitamin D, and magnesium when it comes to sleep. So if you correct your vitamin D, in theory, you could be helping your melatonin. If you correct your melatonin, now I haven't seen this in science, but it would follow the logic, you could potentially be helping your vitamin D. But, you also need to present your body with cofactors and enable the production, just like melatonin. Melatonin's production actually comes from tryptophan. Tryptophan is an essential amino acid, but there are about five steps between tryptophan and the production of melatonin. And through those steps, you go from tryptophan to serotonin to melatonin. Now, there are a lot of different enzymes in between there, and some of us have gene variants for those enzymes. So we don't actually have excellent production, even though we might be taking in enough tryptophan, we're taking in enough, whatever nutrient, magnesium is required. Actually, a whole host of nutrients are required for those pathways. So in part, we may actually not have adequate melatonin production because we're nutritionally incomplete, deficient, insufficient. So I just want to mention that as well.
So that's very interesting, Deanna, about the vitamin D melatonin connection. I would add to that, by the way, that vitamin D and melatonin both have an inverted relationship with insulin. And what I've seen, when you have high levels of insulin, you have low levels of vitamin D and low levels of melatonin. And when you correct the insulin problem, and we know 88% of Americans have some form of insulin resistance, the vitamin D and the melatonin goes up. Have you seen that relationship as well?
Yeah, there is a connection with blood sugar balance and insulin. I mean, if you think of it, if melatonin is part of the hormonal web, and there is this relationship between cortisol and melatonin, right? Because cortisol leads us into the day, it's high in the morning hours. Melatonin is higher in the pinnacle of darkness, and cortisol is very much connected to insulin and to and many other hormones. So, the way I see it, it's a very holistic web. And so I do think that there is a connection with insulin. Now, that said, one of the things about melatonin is that, being that it starts to increase when it becomes dim outside, and our eyes are perceiving the darkness, so our melatonin starts up. Certain people have gene variants that will make it more challenging if they're eating at night, in order to process and metabolize food effectively when melatonin is going up. So there is a little bit of that. We do need to just be aware that timing, so much of everything is about not just the what, but the when. So yes, melatonin can help with insulin sensitivity. And we also know that even, scores, which can be connected to blood sugar, especially in that 2 to 4 a.m. time frame, that they can improve with melatonin supplementation. So all in all, I would say yes, there is a relationship with insulin.
All right, so we're starting to understand there's a lot of these amazing connections between melatonin, vitamin D, as you said, magnesium, and now insulin, insulin sensitivity. What about the immune system? What role does melatonin play with the immune system?
Well, if we think about, well, first of all, melatonin is found throughout the body, and it's also found throughout some of the immune system cells.
Mm,
So it's really integral just from a functionality perspective. If we think of, well, where is most of the immune system generated and where's the activity? We know that it's the gastrointestinal tract. And in fact, the GI tract has one of the greatest concentrations of extrapineal melatonin, meaning this is separate from the pineal melatonin, right? So we're just focusing on cellular melatonin. So if we were to look at different cell types, we would see that the GI tract, which is very closely connected to the immune system, it has a 400 time greater concentration of melatonin
wow.
than the pineal gland. So I think that that's pretty interesting. And you know what? Coincidentally, though, I don't feel like we have a very good understanding of why melatonin just happens to be so high in the gut, right? Because we're not sensing light and dark. It seems to be regulated based on eating and eating signals. And in fact, melatonin production has been documented in most of the entire tract. So we're looking at like the lumen, the mucosa, the muscular part, and it seems that there might be a role in the microbiome, and it might also have a role in secretion, motility. But usually, when there's a question about the immune system, like how is it playing a role, we have to go into the gut because that is where some of the research is. In fact, further on to that, what I find really intriguing, because many times I'm talking about the gut brain axis, is that the short chain fatty acids that we produce from prebiotic fibers can help to stimulate certain gut cells to release serotonin and even enhance melatonin
Mm.
production. So I think that that's kind of interesting, right? So, but yes, there seems to be an immune effect. When I asked Dr. Tan, Dr. Ryder, and some of the other people that have been doing melatonin research for decades, could we be taking melatonin prophylactically to help with things like viruses or just the overall health of our immune system? I don't think we know that per se. We don't have like an idea of like prophylactic use to prevent us from getting colds and flus. But one of the mechanisms of melatonin that relates to the immune system is something called phase separation. So phase, PHASE. So within the cell, the way that viruses work is many times they create their own phase within the cell. So many of the cellular organelles kind of have like their own membrane or their own structure, but viruses have the capacity to create a separate type of phase. And actually, amyloid peptides and proteins can do that as well.
Mm.
And it seems as though part of the way that melatonin works is by helping to reduce that phase separation. And a person that has published on this is somebody by the name of Doris Loh, Loh. She has published with Dr. Ryder, and she has really made this like a very prominent feature of melatonin, looking at the synergistic regulation of phase separation in dementia. So, in that happening at the level of, again, looking at the mitochondria, looking at the cell. So, in a way, if we were thinking about viral replication, one of the ways that melatonin could be helpful for immune function is by helping with overall cellular health and helping to prevent that kind of phase separation.
Very interesting. All that makes sense to me. When I travel or when I feel like I'm coming on with something, I do increase my melatonin exogenously. And we'll talk about the different ways to use melatonin a little bit
Yeah.
later and super physiological high doses of melatonin and different ways to use it and some of the experiments that I have done personally. But let's stay on the topic here of melatonin deficiencies. What are some of the signs of a melatonin deficiency. You mentioned it helps us age gracefully. Around age 30, we start to lose melatonin. And melatonin is really important, as we established, for buffering inflammation and helping with oxidative stress. So, what are some general signs or specific signs that we are lacking melatonin?
Fatigue, any kind of mitochondrial dysfunction or disorders relating to fatigue could be an indicator. And in fact, when people start to take melatonin, even though it's used sometimes for helping with sleep, it may actually lead to some mitochondrial changes that could help with energy.
Mm.
Any kind of accelerated aging conditions. So, for people who have premature hair graying or excessive skin fragility, there might be an issue here with overall antioxidant defenses in our repair mechanism. So, that might be an indicator. And that leads me just to think about stress because tryptophan is a really interesting amino acid in the body, and it can travel in a variety of different pathways. So when we are stressed, many times we need more energy, we need more NAD. And tryptophan can go and traverse that pathway. It can also go into serotonin and melatonin. But if we're highly stressed, we're going to take more of that tryptophan to go down that pathway of NAD, and eventually that leads to kynurenine production. And, if we get a buildup of certain acids, that can actually be neurotoxic, but stress can rob us of melatonin. And especially because tryptophan, typically only about 5% of tryptophan is going into serotonin and melatonin. So if we don't even have that and it continues to reduce, that's an issue. The other thing would be any kind of eye issues.
Mm.
So I think about people who are blind or they have cataracts. The eyes are, we might say the windows to the soul, but I would say the windows to melatonin. And so the way that we tend to our eye health is significant for pineal generated melatonin. So if we are on our screens late at night, no protection of our eyes, I don't know about you, but I have noticed just even through my friends and family, more eye disorders, whether it is detached retinas, age-related macular degeneration, myopia, which is nearsightedness, any kind of sight imbalance could impair our ability to produce melatonin, right? And you can even modulate it based on like you wearing the glasses. And then other things could be like what you mentioned before, like blood sugar imbalance. If somebody is highly inflamed, and we know that inflammation is the bedrock of so many different chronic diseases, right? But you have to think that because of melatonin's functions, one of them is as an anti-inflammatory. So if there's something off there, that could be an issue. If we have an issue with gut dysbiosis, the other thing that is really interesting to me is the seasonal transitions. So many people think that, with more darkness of melatonin, more darkness during the winter months means, oh, I have enough melatonin.
Mm.
But the bright morning light is also really important, as you probably know, for ensuring that you're setting the stage for the proper signaling of cortisol and melatonin. So many times, even in the winter months, our melatonin could be off. Summer is a key time that melatonin can be off, actually, because we have extended periods of daylight. And this is also connected to greater UV radiation, greater oxidative stress, and depletions in melatonin. So be thinking about just even changing up how we supplement throughout the year. And the other thing is full moons. This is really interesting. So there was a study that showed, and this was done in a sleep lab. So you don't have the influence of light at night. But essentially, what the researchers found was that 4 days before and 4 days after a full moon, endogenous levels of melatonin were reduced.
Huh.
So that's interesting,
Why do you think that
right?
is?
So, well, if you think more ancestrally as to, why might we be more vigilant and not sleeping as well and have lower melatonin during that time? Is it because we have to be more vigilant and alert because there's greater light at night, more susceptibility, more stress? I don't think we actually know. But for some reason, yeah, I can't answer that. I mean, I can only look at like ancestrally, why would that have happened? Right? Like why I would think that possibly there is more, activity during a full moon. So more animal activity outside, more activity in nature. So we're just overall just more vigilant, and maybe there are some changes to the microbiome as well. I don't know. I think that that's an interesting one though. And that
Very
might also
interesting.
sync up with the menstrual cycle, right? For women who are menstruating with the moon. The other thing would be, any kind of perimenopause, as I'm thinking about the menstrual cycle, perimenopause, postmenopause, a lot of those changes, immune issues, somebody who's constantly getting sick, they're constantly getting colds, flus, pneumonias, that could be an issue. And anybody, I would even say like people who are hyper exercisers. So they have heightened oxidative stress. And so it's like, how do you find the Goldilocks, the just right of enough physical activity where you're not creating leaky gut, you're not creating oxidative stress? You could actually be depleting your melatonin as well. And,
Mm.
just along those lines of exercise, so often, I think about how people are trying to squeeze in going to the gym, right? So they go at night, but yet they're exercising under artificial blue light,
Yeah.
which is kind of worsening I mean, it's good to be exercising, of course. I don't want to discount that. People who are traveling a lot, so they have jet lag, people who
Hmm.
have shift work, so they're working shift work where they're actually like flip-flopping their day and night rhythm, that could be an issue. I mean, there's actually so much. It would be harder to find something that wouldn't be implicated in low melatonin. And
Yeah.
I think that the only thing there would be age, because children notoriously have high endogenous production of melatonin, which leads me to saying as well that we know, why are all these children being given like melatonin gummies in order to sleep? I would say that, if we look at the life cycle from the age of about 3 months to 6 months, a child is developing their microbiome, their levels of melatonin, and especially if the mother is nursing and she's nursing at night, then she's imparting to her child her nightly melatonin levels, which seem to be implicated in establishing a healthy gut microbiome and may even be implicated in reducing things like colic.
Mm.
So, but kids should have pretty high melatonin from their pineal gland unless they don't have good sleep hygiene. They're on, devices at night. Now, there might be indications like ADHD, autism, where there could be some benefit for supplementing with melatonin. But in general, I don't think, that would be one case where I think giving melatonin supplements would not be needed.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, that's so numerous signs of a deficiency. Pretty much most of the symptoms, if not all the symptoms out there, could be possibly linked to a melatonin deficiency. And it makes sense because the role it has on the mitochondria and every cell within the body, with
Yeah.
the exception of the red blood cells, produce or have mitochondria, I should say. So it makes sense. Hey, I want to just briefly interrupt the video you're watching to share something with you. One of my favorite companies that I use for health and longevity and biohacking is a company called Bond Charge. And they have a whole range of incredible products, including the blue light blocking glasses you see me wear right now. But one of my favorite products from them is an infrared sauna blanket. Sauna blanket works by raising your heart rate to a workout or a training session. So you burn more calories while you're actually lying down and relaxing. Also, it's going to cause you to sweat. And one method of flushing out toxins from your body is through sweat. There's also one of my favorite benefits, this endorphin release. Every time I get out of the sauna blanket, I feel like I just got a 60-minute massage. So it's easy to set up. It's super convenient. Head over to bondcharge.com/keto camp. And if you use the coupon code KETOCAMP at checkout, you'll get 15% off your sauna blanket. And actually, any of their products are 15% off with that code. All right, let's get back to today's video. You mentioned excessive exercise. And one of the things that I track personally and teach to a lot of my students is heart rate variability as a good gauge to see if
Yeah.
you're adapting to your stressors, not just exercise, but all stress. And I love tracking HRV. I think it's an important metric. Most people have low HRV. They're not adapting to stress. They're throwing all these biohacks at themselves, like cold plunge sauna, and they're not adapting to it and they're not benefiting. They're actually making themselves worse. So HRV gives you a good gauge to see if you're doing the right amount of biohacking or too much. So The reason I bring this up, Deanna, is because one of the things that I've used in the past is melatonin exogenously to help increase my HRV, and it helps me apply more stressors, do more biohacks, maybe even more exercise, and recover from that exercise because of the role it has in buffering oxidative stress. So I wanted to share that with you. I thought you might find that fascinating.
That's great. I love HRV as a marker. And you're so right that we have to look at our body's ability to adapt and look at the health of the sympathetic nervous system and the overall ANS, autonomic nervous system tone, right? And so melatonin could be helpful for that. And I really like that you use that as a gauge to see whether or not all the things that you're doing are actually benefiting you, because you might actually be creating more stress or not helping the body at all. So kudos to you. That's a really good idea. And I think for everybody's longevity toolkit, that supplemental melatonin is to me a must have. It just is. I just had a friend who just turned 50, and I said, just make sure you're taking your melatonin.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that Dr. Russell Ryder mentioned to me is that, when do neurodegenerative diseases start? They start decades before the
Yeah.
onset, just like autoimmune disease. We know that 7 to 14 years before the onset of an autoimmune disease, we already have autoantibodies, right? So we have to start sooner rather than later. And it doesn't have to be a high dose of melatonin. It could just be smoothing out the gap of what our pineal gland would have been producing. So I think that's important to recognize. Like, we don't have to go supra physiological. And that's why it's good that you use a metric like HRV, because you can see what your body actually needs. Whereas, I think some people look to urinary levels. There are all kinds of questions about testing, and maybe we just even touch on that briefly, because some people want to know, like, just me telling you all of these just general indicators may not be enough for people. And some people like to just see the number. So there are some constraints, right? You can look at saliva, and all saliva will tell you is more or less the dim light melatonin onset. And it has to be done at regular intervals, similar to cortisol, right? Where we would take samples throughout the day and kind of look at the cortisol curve. We would be doing the same to look at the curve of melatonin. But the pineal generated melatonin is going to be highest between 2 and 4 a.m. And any exposure to light is going to negate or suppress your melatonin. So there can be a lot of issues with the testing. And then if people are looking to urinary measures, I think a urine sample could be good. It's just good to see your output, but what it is telling you is how you're metabolizing melatonin. And I want to touch on this for a moment, because I think it's one of those overlooked things that melatonin is actually metabolized primarily by cytochrome 1A1 and 1A2, right? And so these are the same enzymes that metabolize caffeine.
Mm-hmm.
So melatonin does go through hepatic detoxification, and some people are fast metabolizers of caffeine, which means that if you can apply the same to melatonin, thinking that it works with the same enzyme, number one, they could compete. So if you're drinking coffee all day, you could impair or impact your melatonin degradation and breakdown. But if you're a fast metabolizer, you might have to adjust your dose of melatonin. So that is something that I discovered for myself, that I started with a 0.3 milligram dose, which is some people talk about 0.1 milligrams or even up to 1 milligram, just as a physiological patching the gap kind of a dose with age. And I think for me, I'm a fast metabolizer. So I can have an espresso at 9 p.m. and go right to bed. Does it impact
I'm
me?
slow. I'm the opposite of you.
You're the opposite. Okay, so
Yeah.
you're like my husband. So my husband would get groggy from even 0.3 milligrams of melatonin in the morning. And I said, you have to back it up. You've got to take your melatonin not for 40 to 60 minutes before bedtime, like I do. You have to take it like 2 hours. You have to experiment. Like, what is your best? Is it 2 hours before bedtime, 3 hours before bedtime? Because your body needs a little bit more time in order to metabolize the melatonin and to run it through. So when people are looking at a urinary test, that's what that's telling you, is how well you're metabolizing it, how well you're putting a sulfur group on that melatonin that you're taking in. But of course, that can be dependent on your own genetics, what you eat in that day, your liver health. One of the things, Ben, that people ask about too is, well, why am I waking up at between 2 and 4 a.m.? That's like a common thing. And I do
Yeah.
think that melatonin, depending on when you're taking it, melatonin is great at getting you to sleep, but it's not necessarily responsible for keeping you asleep. That's not
Mhm.
what it's about. It's about reducing sleep latency. But melatonin tends to be high at that 2 to 4 a.m. mark when people tend to be waking up. That's like it's pinnacle of darkness, right? But if you look at other things during that time, many times blood sugar tends to be low. Detoxification, we didn't talk about it yet, but lymphatic fluid flux and looking
Mm.
at brain detoxification. In traditional Chinese medicine, my husband happens to be an acupuncturist, so we have these east-west conversations all the time. And in TCM chronotherapy, they have 2-hour increments for organ systems, and 1 to 3 a.m. is the liver. It's the liver time. So, why are we waking up between 2 and 4? Is it because we have increased toxin load, whether that's through the brain, through the liver? The antioxidant defenses are at their peak. So, we might just have a lot of activity in the body, more inflammation, more antioxidant activity at that time occurring if we happen to be waking up. And we see that that tends to happen more with progressed age. And some sleep experts would suggest that because we have certain sleep cycles and, we're handing off one cycle to the next. There are all kinds of different reasons for this. But melatonin, just through the metabolism and through detoxification, there might be something going on there between that 2 to 4 a.m. time frame.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that is very common. I hear that a lot too. I keep waking up at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. I know that it's liver time, like you mentioned. Very interesting. That's when we need peak melatonin as well. One of the things I want to now dive into with you is supplementation. You mentioned a little bit starting really low, but there's different ways to supplement. There's of course oral capsules, there's suppositories. I've done both personally. Um, but the thought before we get into the specifics of supplementation, you mentioned that melatonin is an antioxidant and a hormone. And most people think, okay, hormone, all right. If I took testosterone or progesterone or human growth hormone or other hormones, doesn't my body stop producing it because I'm taking it exogenously? There's a negative feedback loop with that. Is there a negative feedback loop with melatonin? I haven't seen it, but I want to know what you've seen.
The answer is no. I get this question all the time, and it caused me to go into the research and to ask some of the experts, right? So, there are at least 4 research studies that have shown that melatonin from supplementation does not impact endogenous production. If you look at a lot of the earlier work from Dr. Paolo Lassoni, who is an oncologist in Italy, he started using it for people with cancer undergoing chemotherapy. If you look at decades worth of his research, clinical use, there's no report that people have changed levels. And also, let's just go back to what I mentioned before that our levels of melatonin with age tend to be negligible.
Hmm.
So, what are we afraid of reducing if we have like almost no melatonin production from the pineal gland, right? So, um, and also to Dr. Tan's point, perhaps taking exogenous melatonin could actually help our mitochondria to make more. Now, again, the jury's still out on that, but I do think that we are priming our body better in order to, just have reduced risk of chronic diseases and the such. But no, I get that question all the time. And from what I can see from the research studies that are available, we do not have an indication that pineal melatonin is impacted by taking this exogenous type of melatonin. Now, people are experimenting a lot with different doses. And I'm speaking to doses that would be in the single digit range. There aren't many studies in the double digits. So I'm talking like 10 milligrams and greater. I'd be curious about what you have tried and what you have taken because, if we look at the studies and what people are taking, we're looking at in terms of the longevity, 6 months to 2 years. Typically, we see a good safety profile, no issues with endogenous production. So, but that is more or less my answer to that. That
Yeah,
Dr. Ryder would also say we don't see that, and he's
yeah.
been studying melatonin since 1960.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I've seen too, right? And I've dug into the research like you. I've looked at Dr. Ryder's research. I have a good friend, Dr. John Lawrence, who wrote a book, Melatonin Miracle Molecule, and nobody has seen a negative feedback loop with melatonin in humans, at least. So that's
Right.
comforting to know that you have seen something similar. Now, with those are with doses of 3 milligrams, single digit milligrams of melatonin, which is like the most common use. I have experimented with 200 milligrams of melatonin suppository before. There's not a lot of research on these super high doses, so I don't take it consistently. I take it cyclically just because I'm not sure what will happen if I took 200 milligrams of melatonin for like 3 months. So I have never taken it for more than 7 days, but I do really well with it. I feel really good with it. I'll take it during times of stress, travel. If I want to throw something into the mix to change things up, I'll use a 200 milligram suppository. And I haven't noticed any adverse effects. I could do it for 3 days, 3 nights in a row, stop taking it, and be just fine. But again, I didn't do it long term. I've never done it long term.
Yeah, well, and it's worthwhile to try certain things, especially if we think that they're safe and you're not doing them consistently, but everybody is a little bit different in that. The only thing that I'll say is that some researchers, like Dr. Richard Wertman from years back, would suggest that after a while you saturate the receptors.
I
So,
heard you talk
there's a
about
point of,
that. Yeah. Explain.
yeah. So, and again, like you said, we don't have a lot of human clinical data looking at higher doses and looking at that specifically. But are you just plugging into the receptors constantly? And after a while, do you stop seeing the signal? I don't know. It's just something to think about because sometimes a little it can go a long way, right? In terms of like if you think of like a plant adaptogen, sometimes you just need that small amount to actually perturb the cell in such a way to stimulate activity. But if you do high doses all the time, do your cells just stop seeing it? So if we just look at the research and where the preponderance of data would be, we're looking at mostly single digit in terms of the longer term studies. When you look at some of the shorter term, like maybe 7 day studies, you can see doses anywhere between 20 to 40 milligrams, sometimes up to 50 milligrams. And that again is coming from Dr. Losoni's work. So there's that. I think, dose is everything and also the format. There are at least two different publications that I can think of where they comment on the different derivatives and the contaminants that you can find in synthetically produced melatonin.
Share that.
So what
What do
has
they find?
happened? Yeah, so there are a variety of different ones. In one of the articles, they cited like 13 different contaminants. And so we're talking about serotonin derivatives, phthalimide derivatives. And so what has happened, just to back up for a second, is that melatonin was discovered in 1958. Like, just to put it in perspective of like how far we're going back, even though it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous, it's like part of nature, it still wasn't actually chemically codified until 1958. Then we started to see more research on the pineal gland. And that was like its first extraction was from the pineal gland of animals. But as you can imagine, there would be all kinds of issues with that. Prions, just even it's not sustainable. Like the pineal gland is so small, and then you're just producing melatonin at a certain time point, right? So that's not really sustainable. So what people ended up doing was using a chemical derived process in order to harness greater levels of melatonin. So I would say that even if you look on Amazon, a majority, like we're talking about 99% of melatonin supplements are synthetically made. So
That
it's just
high,
something to think.
99%.
It is because if you look at any of the plant, just whole matrix type of supplements, I mean, they are increasing, but truly a majority of the supplements out there are synthetic, which may be okay if you can vouch for the source and you've asked the manufacturer about the quality because a supplement is only as good as its quality, right? And what I have seen, okay, this is my other pet peeve after being in the dietary industry, dietary supplement industry for some time is that many times melatonin is put in there with other herbs that sometimes can modify that cytochrome 1A2 activity. So
Mm,
now you're actually going to change the metabolism of the melatonin, and sometimes unknowingly, right? A lot of herbs can modify some of these cytochrome enzymes. So we have to be really in tune with the formulation that we take. And
that
for
is
people who
interesting.
like, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's very interesting. I haven't even thought about that. It's interesting, and you make a good point. We have to be careful with these blends of melatonin and other herbs because we don't know what's happening. It's fascinating, but continue.
We don't. I mean, we call that, I mean, in the industry, sometimes those formulas are called the kitchen sink formulas, right?
Mm,
Because you've got a lot of different things. And yes, mechanistically, we could say, okay, this is for that. This is for the other thing. This is for that. But when they're all together, this polypharmacy, how is that actually interacting in the body? Right. So, I'd like to give your audience too a couple of hacks to help their melatonin work better because some people
please.
do like a slower release form of melatonin. But one of the things I don't like so much about the slow release formats is that usually they have some kind of phthalate, paraben, or something added in order to, or an enteric coating of some kind that, again, why have an endocrine disruptor with something that is supposed to be healthy for you, right? There is that to consider, that some people want to keep that melatonin kind of that trajectory prolonged and they work better when it goes into the body very slowly. You can also modify it by having it with fish oil or some kind of fat, almond butter or whatever somebody prefers in terms of just bringing in a little bit of fat to delay the absorption of it.
Interesting.
So, yeah, that's something to think about. Now, there is one I was asking you about mentioning this particular melatonin that I like, which is called 𝙈𝙁𝑇𝑜nin. And 𝙈𝙁𝑇Onin is not an extract of melatonin. It's actually the concentrate from plants in the original matrix. And a group had compared synthetically derived melatonin compared with 𝙈𝙁𝑇Onin, and they found that the 𝙈𝙁𝑇Onin, because it's got other things in there from the plant, had 6 times greater anti-inflammatory activity when they compare them in a cell model looking at COX-2, which is just one of the many different inflammatory compounds to be looking at. It's a key one. So they found 646% greater activity
Wow.
when they had the 𝙈𝙁𝑇Onin, right? So then if you think of it, if you're taking 0.3 milligrams of 𝙈𝙁𝑇Onin and you think, okay, but I'm really getting 6 times greater efficacy as it relates to anti-inflammatory, is it really like 1.8 milligrams, right? Times 6, right? Or when they looked at the free radical scavenging, they found up to 470% greater scavenging of a free radical. So that's also important to consider that the activity of the compound that you're looking for, the molecule in this case of melatonin, can so be influenced by whatever else is in that supplement, how it's made. And I'm just a plant person. I mean, I've got nothing against keto or eating animal products, but I do look to plants for the intelligence that they bring into our system. That's why I call it the phytoneuroendocrine system,
Mm,
PHYTO for plant, right? How are we informing neurotransmitters, hormones, our entire circuitry through that intelligence of plants? So with 𝙈𝙁𝑇Onin, that's why I like it because a little can go a long way. And it does have certain things in it like lutein and zeaxanthin, which just naturally occur in the plants. So then the lutein and zeaxanthin are important because they help to protect the eye from blue light. Now, there's not like a huge amount of lutein and zeaxanthin in the 𝙈𝙁𝑇Onin, but it does have this complex. It's got the essential amino acids, it's got some fatty acids, it's got some of the other plant compounds like even chlorophyll. So I think that plants, back to your earlier question, I think that we're always looking for diversity, teamwork. What is nutrition really? It's about the power of relationship and how things are all interrelated. And sometimes you can get an amplification when you have the natural constituents of how that molecule occurs in nature. And we know that in traditional Chinese medicine. That's why many times an herbal formula has certain herbs and certain actives to potentiate the activity of what you want to happen.
Yeah, all that makes sense to me. Herbatonin sounds very interesting. I want to try it myself. You helped formulate that, or you did some of the research. You were involved somehow, I think you told me, correct?
No, actually, I'm not the brain trust on that at all.
No?
But I do work as chief science officer with the company. The company is called Symphony Natural Health, and I love their products because they just have a very limited product line, but everything is in integrity and everything is novel and they do science. So that's why I have decided to work with them because I take their products and I just feel like there's science to support using what they have with respect to herbatonin versus just a synthetic melatonin that you're going to find on the market.
Love it. We'll put a link for it down below. One of the things that I discovered when I was looking at how much of melatonin taken orally is actually metabolized, I believe the number was like 2.7%, I believe. Is that accurate? Like how much of it when we take oral, if we take, say, 1 milligram, how much of that is actually being metabolized?
It depends on, well, you're talking about bioavailability or metabolism, because I don't know if you know.
Bioavailability is more accurate.
Yeah, bioavailability in women would be something on the order of close to 17%. And for men, it would be lower, like around 8 to 9%.
Huh.
So, but don't, I would say also don't discount the gut and perhaps, what could be happening there.
Good point.
Any melatonin we do take can cross the blood-brain barrier, just FYI. Back to the point of what I mentioned about melatonin being amphiphilic. It's fat soluble and water soluble, so it can cross, or at least that's been shown in preclinical models because you can't really do that study in humans very well, but it can cross the blood-brain barrier. So yeah, bioavailability tends to be a little bit lower, but again, if you have the matrix of something where it normally occurs, or you add a little bit of fat, I have found that for me, because I'm a fast metabolizer, I need just a little bit of, like something fatty that I take just to kind of give me that added, not a lot, but it's just something to bring in if people are taking fish oil anyway. You don't want a lot in your stomach late at night, obviously, so it would have to be a small amount, but that could be helpful in the bioavailability.
Makes sense. That makes sense. What about those? And I think you had kind of brought it up earlier about genetic SNPs. There are some people that take melatonin and get the complete opposite effect where it keeps them up the entire night. What percentage of people deal with that and what's going on there?
That's called a paradoxical effect. And I don't know if that's only related to genetics. That might actually be related to the formula. Many times when I ask people who have
Interesting.
this paradoxical effect, I ask them, like, number one, what is the dose? Number two, what is the formula? Let me look at it. Number three, did you vouch for the purity and to ensure that there's nothing in there, nothing toxic, right? So, and also what I haven't mentioned until now, but it's a big deal, is that there are contraindications with different, I would say, medications of various types. Yes, we talked about supplements. There can be interactions there, but there can be some interactions with different drugs. So, is the effect coming through liver metabolism? So, there can be a lot of different things there. So I don't know if we can just say that the gene variant, there is one particular gene variant that's more about insulin and processing as it relates to melatonin and kind of looking at blood sugar balance. But the paradoxical effect, because I've asked Dr. Ryder about this too, and in his experience, the amount of people that have that have been negligible. Um, so I don't know, but I have heard from a few people. But again, when I drill down and start to ask questions, they're like, oh, yeah, I took it in this form. And, then I say, well, just try with herbatonin just to see if it would be different. Just try it versus a different melatonin formulation and see if you still get it. The other thing would be just backing out and trying it at a different time before bedtime, right?
Hmm.
That you can help to potentially negate that paradoxical effect. Or, maybe you are a person where it's having such an impact on your blood sugar and it's helping you with insulin sensitivity to the degree that you wake up in the middle of the night because you have low blood sugar. Like you, I like to hack certain aspects of my physiology. And for a while, I was wearing an Aura ring and I had a CGM on. And I was waking up in the middle of the night and I'm like, what is going on? And I noticed if I didn't wear them together, I would not have seen this in the same way. But my blood sugar was going to 40 at night, like right at the time I was waking up. When normally my blood sugar, my fasting blood sugar is like between 80 and 85.
Mm.
And so I was going down. And I think it was just like my body's stress signal and I was fasting way too long. This is when I learned I should not do a 16-hour fast. That was not a good thing for me. So it wasn't to do with the melatonin for me, but yes, you could have a paradoxical kind of like where you wake up and, it could be implicated in so many different things. Again, ask yourself the question of like dose. Do you have the right dose for you? Look at your nighttime light exposure. Ben, one other thing I wanted to mention before I forget it, and that is about the color of people's eyes. So there was a very interesting study showing that people with green, blue, or light brown eyes had greater suppression of melatonin production at night when exposed to artificial blue light compared to people with dark brown eyes. So what does that mean? That means that, and I believe that the suppression was like 17% greater.
Wow.
So in other words, you can be up to 20% lower on your endogenous melatonin if you have light eyes and you're exposing your eyes to that artificial blue light at night. So it's even more important for those individuals like myself, I have green eyes, to wear the blue light blocking glasses because first of all, you're protecting your eyes, and you're preserving whatever you have of your endogenous pineal melatonin.
That is interesting. I have blue eyes too, so I'm glad I wear my red blue light blocking glasses at night. During the day, it's yellow to orange to red is the transition. That's fascinating. 17% suppression. Interesting.
Yeah, it was
Um,
around 17% compared to dark eyes. However, on the flip side, for those of us like you and me with light colored eyes, there tends to be like that you're less prone to seasonal affective disorder.
mm,
And I think it's just because our eyes grab light. Like we're more sensitive. I don't know about you, but I've always been like my eyes are very sensitive to light. Like
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
these are like for the computer, right? So I kind of stage my eyes like you through the day, but I'm so sensitive to light, I have to dim the screen. So if just by your nature, your eyes are sensitive, even if you have dark brown eyes, then you should be wearing the glasses. Just because you have dark brown eyes does not mean you should not be wearing blue light blocking glasses. I think
Yeah.
kind of go with your sensitivity.
Yeah, that's a fair point. We're not telling you because you have dark eyes to not wear the glasses. Still wear the glasses, avoid artificial blue light, especially at nighttime.
Minerals, minerals, minerals. You hear a lot of people out there speaking about the benefits of taking minerals, and it is important because in this day and age, our crops, our fruits, and our vegetables, they are depleted of minerals. So you've heard of the keto flu, you've heard of symptoms doing keto and fasting. People just don't feel good sometimes. This is the number one reason why. So my go-to for replenishing my electrolytes and my minerals, for enhancing my immune system, for gut support, for detoxification, is Bean Minerals. It has fulvic and humic compounds, and these have over 70 trace minerals and really important electrolytes to replenish your body with. Check out Bean Minerals over at beanminerals.com. Use the coupon code Azadi, my last name, at checkout to get a nice discount. That is AZADI at checkout over at beanminerals.com.
You told me to remind you about foods that may support melatonin production.
Yeah. And then I want to also make sure we have time to talk about light and light exposure.
Mhm.
Okay. So back to foods for a second, because I am a nutrition scientist and many people are asking just like, what are the foods to help with melatonin production? And, first and foremost, yes, we have to ensure that we're getting enough protein, right? Protein is all the rage these days. We hear a lot about it. Protein helps with metabolic detoxification, so many different things, but it ensures that we're getting tryptophan if we're taking in tryptophan sources, so like turkey and nuts and a variety of different protein containing foods, right? So tryptophan to serotonin to melatonin. There are a number of different nutrients, like I mentioned, that we need for those conversions. So tryptophan to 5-HTP, we need things like iron and folate and calcium. We need B vitamins. Then we go from 5-HTP to serotonin. We need a whole bunch of things for that, like zinc, vitamin C. We need magnesium. We need B vitamins like B12, folate. Then we go from serotonin into, I'm not going to go through each of them, but eventually we get to melatonin, and we need things like magnesium and other things for that. So just at a very basic biochemical pathway perspective, we need to ensure that we're starting that pathway with protein. But then you could say, well, what about just like if I were to have tart cherries before bedtime? Because I see that on social media all the time. So when we wrote this paper on melatonin, I was really interested in that. I wanted to see whether having foods that were considered high melatonin containing foods could give you a physiological dose of melatonin. So you'll actually see it in the paper where I did this calculation, and I had to have, a few people check my math on this, because what I had to do, it was quite like, it was pretty complicated, because I had to actually find an article with a certain cherry variety where they measured the melatonin, and that level is not standardized, right? So that's something to just be aware of, that seasonally cherries can produce different amounts of melatonin, even when they're picked could lead to different amounts of melatonin. So I had to find an article that gave me a range of melatonin. So then I took that, and then I looked at 0.3 milligrams of just like a physiological dose of melatonin. And I took that range in the article. And I just know this number because it's been branded in my mind, talking about it all these all these years. But it would take 2,718 tart cherries
My
of the
gosh.
variety that I found in this paper in order to get 0.3 milligrams of melatonin. Okay, so it's not to say that I would not advise having tart cherries. I have tart cherry juice in the refrigerator right now as a medicine. I think it's high in polyphenols, it's high in vitamin C, it's high in very interesting polyphenols. And polyphenols, vitamin D, and melatonin, in my mind, are all chronobiotics. So polyphenols may not work in the same way as melatonin, but they're very supportive for healthy circadian rhythm. And maybe that's what's going on with tart cherries, right?
Mm.
So again, plants don't standardize. They're not like a supplement. So you don't know what you're getting in a handful of walnuts for your melatonin. But it's not to say that walnuts and cherries aren't good foods and aren't anti-inflammatory, have healthy fats, are like rich in certain phytochemicals that would be anti-inflammatory. So from that perspective, I think they could be supportive. It's just that, you don't want to be eating before bedtime, and you'd have to eat a lot of foods in order to get your daily dose of melatonin, even at a very basic amount.
That is so funny and so interesting. It's similar to the resveratrol and red wine conversation. You have to drink a ton of red wine to get the benefits from resveratrol. Kind of cancels out the benefits if you do that. So yeah, don't eat that many tart cherries, or especially right before bed. Although
Get a
there is,
stomach ache.
yeah, although there's a time and place for it. Like you mentioned, there's benefits to
Yeah.
tart cherry, but not in regards to melatonin production. Okay, great breakdown there. Now let's dive into light. We land the plane here on melatonin. What did you want to share about light?
Yeah, I think back to the old adage, if you don't measure it, you don't change it. And so when we talk about light and darkness, and we talk about darkness deficiency in the paper, that people don't have enough darkness, well, how do you know? People can just say, well, I'm just wearing my blue light blocking glasses and I'm good. But you actually need to measure the light in your environment. So the way that light is measured, and you might even have a good app for this. My favorite app is called Light Meter. It's no charge. It's a really easy to use app. It's called Light Meter Lux, actually. So when you download it, it's like you just use your camera on your phone and you point it to wherever your eyes are. So if you're just like this, I mean, you really have to like make sure it's like at eye level, and you just see how much light you're getting. 1 lux of light, that's a unit of light. 1 lux is equal to a candle flame 3 feet away, just for perspective. So I was at the beach with my husband. We were vacationing, and I brought out my lux meter, And I was at like at 12 noon, it was 15,000 lux.
Wow.
15, right? But most of the day when we're indoors, and I've actually tested it for myself because right now I'm in front of a window. So right now I'm at and I've tested it depending on the time of day, it could be between 400 and 2,000 lux. Nowhere near
Wow.
what I'd be getting outside, right? It's good that I'm facing a window and not facing a wall because that would be even worse. So what we have done with light and dark is we've obviously flip-flopped it, right? So we wake to basically darkness. We're not getting that bright light exposure, which we need for cortisol and melatonin to set the rhythm for the next night of sleep. But measure your sleeping room. This is really instrumental. Like once it starts to get dim at night, you want to be sure that you're not exceeding like 10 lux. 10
Interesting.
lux, which actually is not so bad. It's not so dark. I've actually tried this for myself. We have a whole system in our house of LED or just these Philips Hue bulbs so we can kind of dim it, but then we can also change the color so we can make it more red hue. But for 3 hours before bed, and these are according to guidelines that are published and established, but 3 hours before bed, you want minimal blue light and you want 10 lux, max 10 lux in your environment. You can use dimmers. I've talked to Dr. Terry Walls before, who I think you probably know her. So she
Yeah.
has multiple sclerosis. And we talked about people that need to get up and use the bathroom at night and how some people don't have great mobility. And, even a little night light, you want to just see how that figures for lux. But typically you'd be okay with like a night light. But try to refrain from bright light if you have to wake up in the middle of the night. Like if
Yeah.
you're using the restroom, try to like keep it very dim because you're going to change your melatonin production.
Yeah, that's good advice. That's really interesting to measure the lux. I haven't done that. Now I'm inspired to try this app,
Ah,
Light Meter Lux, and measure the lux during the day, but also at night, what's going on in my bedroom. That'll be really fascinating to see. And yet, to your point, I don't really wake up in the middle of the night. But if I did, if let's say I had a lot of water to drink, I'll wake up to use to urinate in the middle of the night. I leave all the lights off. It's like peeing in the dark. I'm not turning on any light. Everything is dark because I don't want that cortisol spike and that melatonin production or suppression to happen. And I go back to bed. I'm like, damn, just laying there. So yeah, do it in the dark. It's no big deal. Just don't make a mess. But that is really interesting about the Lux app. I'm going to test that out. Uh, Deanna, I have one final question for you. Before I ask the final question, share with my audience where they can learn more about you and check out your work.
sure. My website, deannaminich.com. So it's DEANNAMINICH.com. If people want to know about herbatonin, they could go to symphonynaturalhealth.com, and it's also on Amazon. You can just check it out there. And on the website, though, you'll see the studies. So if you're somebody like who likes to geek out on like what does the research say, then you would find that on the symphonynaturalhealth.com site.
Very
So,
cool.
and you can
Yeah.
find me on Instagram and those kinds of places.
We'll put all of that in the notes down below. Go check out Dr. Deanna Minich and her research and all the wonderful things that you're doing. Here's the final question, Deanna. It's about a supplement that I call vitamin G. Now, this is the last question I ask all the guests about this supplement called vitamin G. In my book, chapter 10 is about how your thoughts influence your metabolism and your health. And there's a huge section on vitamin G and what vitamin G does to boost serotonin, oxytocin, all the wonderful things that we know melatonin does as well. So I call it vitamin G. It's vitamin gratitude. It's the practice of gratitude and all the amazing anti-inflammatory healing benefits that come when you get a nice dosage of vitamin G. So the question I always ask at the end of my podcast interviews is this: what do you have gratitude vitamin G for today, Deanna?
Today, right now, being alive, having
Yes.
health, talking with you, my family, my friends, just to be able to do the work that I love in the world and to be of service. It really feels good to be able to do that. And to know that even exercising, this morning I went for a walk and I really felt like I'm grateful that I can move my body. So many people may not have this opportunity. So thanks for that question. I like it. I'm grateful for a lot. And so yeah.
If you enjoyed that conversation, you're going to love a brand new interview I just released with Dr. William Li All about the best foods to starve cancer, burn fat, repair DNA, and heal the body.
So I'm not saying yogurt's bad, I'm saying yogurt's good. However, the blueberry flavored yogurt, there's like a band of jelly. So you open it up, you stir it up, and now you've got your blueberry low-fat yogurt. Good for you, right? You got berries, you got low-fat. Wrong.